The bulkhead wept, each drip a tiny hammer in the pressurized silence. Ping, the destroyer's sonar, right above them. A casual hunting sound. Korvettenkapitän Jürgen Richter held the steel rail, his knuckles white against the gray, sweating metal. The air in the control room was thick, smelling of battery acid, unwashed bodies, and burnt oil. 44 men breathing poison. "She's venting, Herr Kaleun," the chief engineer whispered, his voice a raw crackle over the hum of the dying gyro. Richter nodded, his gaze fixed on the depth gauge. 180 meters. Far below crush depth, but not by enough. Ping. "He's toying with us," First Officer WW2 Metz grated. His youthful face was a mask of ideological purity. "We surface. We fight. One torpedo for the Führer." "The hydrophones are shattered, Metz. The hull is compromised. We do not surface. Cowardice." The word was sharp. Metz's hand moved, not toward the controls, but toward the Walther holstered on his belt. "If you will not give the order, I will." Richter looked at the WW2, then at the terrified, acne-scarred face of the 17-year-old radio operator. He saw only dead boys. "You will stand down, Lieutenant." "I will not." The click of the safety being disengaged echoed louder than the sonar. The concrete smelled of mold and defeat. Korvettenkapitän Jürgen Richter stood in the cavernous gloom of the U-boat pen, the sixth one built into the cliffs of La Rochelle. The massive, reinforced structure was meant to be a symbol of impregnable fortress Europe. To Richter, it was a tomb, a place where steel coffins were loaded with boys and pointed toward the abyss. He sipped the ersatz coffee. It tasted like burnt acorns and suspicion. "Torpedoes loaded, Herr Kaleun." Richter turned. Leutnant Metz, his first officer, WW2, stood with a ramrod posture that seemed to defy the damp, oppressive air. Metz was new, transferred from the naval staff, his uniform still sharp, his mind sharper, honed by the Reich's ideology. He was barely 25. "And the new acoustic heads, Lieutenant?" Richter asked, his voice deliberately flat. "Tested and certified by the Armory. They will seek the enemy's propeller noise. A miracle weapon." "Miracles," Richter said, running a hand over the cold, gray skin of U-998. "Are in short supply. Did you inspect the detonators yourself?" A flicker of irritation in Metz's eyes. "I trust the technicians, Herr Kaleun. They are good Germans." "I trust the sea, Lieutenant. It is a very bad German. It wants us dead. Inspect them again." Metz's jaw tightened, but he snapped a salute. "Jawohl, Herr Kaleun." He marched away, his boots echoing with hollow importance. Richter sighed, the sound lost in the drip, drip, drip of water from the vaulted ceiling. He was 42. He had been a submariner in the last war, a cadet when this one started, and a wolf during the happy time. He had sunk ships. He had watched men drown. Now the ocean was full of Allied radar, air patrols, and hunter-killer groups. The happy time was a distant, bloody memory. 1944 was the time of the hunted. He walked past the conning tower, his eyes scanning the new faces. Children. So many of them were kinder. He saw one, the new radio operator, struggling with a crate. 17 years old, perhaps. His cheeks still held the soft roundness of youth, now pale with the subterranean pallor of the bunker. The boy saw him looking and fumbled the crate. "Herr Kaleun, my apologies." Richter merely nodded, walking on. What was the point in learning their names? He entered the U-boat. The familiar smell hit him. Recycled air, diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the faint, lingering odor of cabbage. Home. His chief engineer, Wegener, A man his own age, with weary eyes, was checking the gauges. "She's tight, Jürgen," Wegener said, using his first name only when they were deep in the boat. "But the port batteries, they don't hold a full charge. The replacements were bad." "Ersatz," Richter said. The word defined their lives. Substitute, fake. Their coffee, their rubber seals, their batteries, their hope. "We make do." Wegener tapped the gauge. "But she won't give us much time under the English. 5 hours of silent running, maybe. After that—" He didn't need to finish. Before Richter could reply, the hatch squeaked open. The young radio operator scrambled in, holding a flimsy sheet of paper. "Herr Kaleon, from OKM, just decoded." Richter took the paper. It was an Enigma message. His eyes scanned the coordinates. Grid square Seawolf, then the target. Convoy HX-310. A cold, familiar dread settled in his stomach. HX-310 was a fast convoy, heavily protected. Seawolf was the grid-square Allied Coastal Command used for target practice. It was a known kill zone, saturated with aircraft from the Azores and hunter-killer groups. This wasn't a mission. It was a disposal. Metz climbed back into the control room, his face flushed. "Detonators confirmed, Herr Kaleon. Ready to—" Richter handed him the paper. Metz read it, and a strange, bright light came into his eyes. A zealot's fire. "At last," he breathed. "A real target, a glorious fight. The Führer asks much, and we will deliver." Richter looked at the engineer, Wegener. He looked at the 17-year-old radio operator. He looked at the weeping concrete walls of the pen. "Leutnant," Richter said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the sea. "Secure the boat. Prepare to cast off." "Jawohl, Herr Kaleon," Metz shouted, energized. Richter turned to the control panel. He felt the U-998 vibrate as the diesel engines coughed to life. The massive steel-plated doors of the bunker began to grate open, letting in a sliver of gray, hostile Atlantic daylight. Metz was already at the periscope, humming. Richter gripped the rail. He was not a wolf. He was a shepherd, leading his flock, of 44 souls, from one tomb into another. "Take us out, Leutnant." The Bay of Biscay was a gray, undulating sheet of liquid steel. U-998 ran on the surface, its diesel engines thrumming a low, monotonous rhythm that vibrated through the soles of Richter's boots. The salt spray was a constant, icy sting. Richter stood on the bridge, his binoculars sweeping the horizon. The sky was the color of dirty cotton wool, a low, oppressive ceiling. This was the Tal des Todes, the Valley of Death. In 42, they would have run this gauntlet with a degree of arrogance. Now, in 44, it was a gauntlet of radar. Every man on the bridge was a lookout, their eyes raw from the wind, scanning not just the horizon for ships, but the clouds for the shadows. 2 degrees port, helmsman, Richter said, his voice clipped by the wind. He was navigating a precise, randomized zigzag pattern, a pathetic attempt to fool any Allied radar listening from the coast. 2 degrees port, Herr Kaleon, the helmsman echoed from below. Metz was on the opposite side of the bridge, sweeping his own binoculars. Unlike Richter, who scanned with a slow, methodical weariness, Metz hunted the sky. He wanted a contact. He craved the confrontation, the test of his new flak guns. Richter knew the truth. The Vierling 20mm cannons were useless against a determined heavy patrol bomber. They were a morale booster, a last-ditch bite that only served to confirm the U-boat's position before the bombs fell. The only defense in the Bay of Biscay was not to be seen. "Flieger!" The cry came from the aft lookout, his voice cracking with panic. "Aircraft! Starboard 40, high!" Richter's binoculars snapped to the coordinates. It was there. A tiny, 4-engined speck growing larger, a Sunderland, a flying porcupine. It was already banking, descending toward them, a predator that had found its mark. There was no thought, only reaction. Decades of training took over. "Alarm!" Richter bellowed, his voice cutting through the engine noise. He slammed the klaxon button himself. "Crash dive! Crash dive!" The bridge cleared in less than 3 seconds. Men scrambled down the hatch, falling more than climbing. Richter was the last, sealing the hatch above him, his boots hitting the control room deck just as the boat's horn blared its deafening, repetitive warning. "Flood all! Vents open! Hard to dive!" The U-998 pitched forward violently. The deck angled 30 degrees. Richter gripped the rail, his knuckles white. The roar of the diesels died, replaced by the high-pitched whine of the electric motors and the deafening hiss of venting ballast tanks. The boat was a falling elevator. "Passing 20 meters," the engineer shouted. "Rig for silent running. We should have fought them." Metz's voice was sharp, laced with accusation, even as he held on. "Herr Kalin, the flak guns!" "Silence, Leutnant!" Richter snapped. His eyes never left the depth gauge. "You cannot fight a Sunderland in broad daylight. You only give him a cleaner shot. You die. He radios your position. We hide." "Timidity," Metz began. "It is tactics, Leutnant. You will learn the difference." The boat passed 60 meters. The steep angle began to level out. The agonizingly loud hiss of the vents closed, plunging the boat into a sudden, pressurized quiet. Now there was only the hum of the gyros and the electric motors, and the listening. "Hydrophones?" Richter whispered. The young radio operator, his face pale and slick with sweat, pressed the headphones tight against his ears. He was listening to the ocean. "Engine noise, Herr Kalin? Propellers, high speed, directly above." A tense, collective intake of breath. The crew froze. Every man was motionless, trying not to make a sound. The Sunderland was circling. It knew exactly where they had dived. Then came the sound. Not the boom of a charge, but a series of distinct splashes. Plop, 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 plop. Metz looked confused. Richter knew what they were. Marker buoys. The plane was boxing them in, laying a pattern for the destroyers that would soon be on their way. "He's not attacking," Richter whispered, mostly to himself. "He's marking. Hydrophones. New transmission." The operator's eyes went wide. "High frequency. From the aircraft. He is reporting. Herr Kalin. He is reporting our position. Encrypted. Strong signal." Richter closed his eyes for a single second. The turning point. The irrevocable fact. They had been at sea for less than 6 hours. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. He felt Metz's stare. It was no longer just accusation. It was contempt. The young IWO believed Richter had shirked a fight. Richter knew he had just delayed their execution. He looked at the depth gauge. 80 meters. "Take her to 100, he ordered, his voice a low monotone that absorbed all the fear in the compartment. "Slow speed. Maintain course 250. We run deep." He would endure. He would endure the enemy above, and he would endure the enemy within. For 3 days, they were ghosts. They ran deep during the daylight hours, the air in the boat growing thick and foul, the CO2 scrubbers hissing a weak protest. At night, they surfaced into the freezing, gale-whipped darkness of the North Atlantic to charge their failing batteries and gulp fresh air. They were alone. The Valley of Death had lived up to its name, but they had slipped through. Now they were in the designated rendezvous grid, Seawolf, a patch of empty, rolling ocean, strategically meaningless, chosen only for its proximity to the convoy lanes. Richter kept the U-998 at periscope depth. The sea was a violent, churning mass of gray and white. "Nothing, Herr Kaleun," the hydrophone operator reported, his voice weary. He had been listening for hours. "No screw noises, no other U-boats." "Stay at your post," Richter ordered. He lowered the periscope, the handles slick with condensation in his grip. The control room was cold, the bulkheads weeping. "They are late," Metz stated. It was not an observation. It was an accusation, though not directed at Richter. At fate, perhaps. "Or they are gone," Richter said, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "The bay was difficult. We were lucky. Others may not have been." "Luck is a defeatist concept, Herr Kaleun. Iron will is what the Führer demands. They will be here. U-413, U-774, U-109. They will come." Richter looked at the chronometer. They were 12 hours past the rendezvous time. The wolf pack, a concept designed to terrify the Allies, had become a joke in late 1944. They were just disparate, desperate boats thrown into a meat grinder, often arriving piecemeal, to be picked off one by one. "We will wait another 6 hours," Richter said. "Then we re-evaluate." "Re-evaluate, Herr Kaleun? The orders are clear. We attack HX-310. "We attack as a pack," Richter corrected, his voice low and sharp. "One boat, even two, against a fast convoy with a dedicated hunter-killer group is not a battle. It is a sacrifice. My duty is to this boat, Leutnant, to the 44 men breathing this foul air, not to a glorious headline in Berlin." Metz's face went pale, his eyes narrowing. "That is borderline hydrophones." The operator cut him off, his body rigid. "Screw noises, bearing 090, slow, a U-boat, I am sure of it." A ripple of energy, the first in days, went through the control room. "Periscope depth," Richter commanded. He swung the optics around. The sea was chaos. He wiped the lens, searching. "There, smoke." "It is." Metz was at the second scope. "A U-boat, on the surface. She is signaling." "A type Psi-C," Richter identified. "She's flashing. What's the code?" The young radio operator scribbled. U-413. "It's U-413, Herr Kaleun. Kapitän Leutnant Bremer." Richter grunted. He knew of Bremer, a boy wonder, barely 26, credited with 5 ships and known for his recklessness. An eagle, as the propaganda ministry called them. "Take us up," Richter ordered. The U-998 broke the surface with a surge, the deck awash in green-white foam. Richter and Metz climbed the ladder to the bridge, the icy wind tearing at them. The other U-boat was 500 meters off, wallowing in the heavy seas. They could see figures on its bridge. "I will signal them, Herr Kaleun," Metz said, moving to the lamp. "You will wait," Richter said. He raised his megaphone. U-413, Richter, U-998. Where are the others? A voice, young and arrogant, crackled back over the wind. "Sunk, old man. All sunk, probably. Just us. But it is enough. The convoy is due in 8 hours. We attack at dusk. 2 is all we need for glory." Richter felt his stomach clench. Bremer was a fool, a true believer. "This is madness, Bremer," Richter yelled back. "The orders are for a pack. We must report. We are compromised." "Report? Reporting is for cowards. We are wolves. We bite. U-998, you will follow my lead." Before Richter could reply, Metz acted. The IWO shoved the signalman aside and grabbed the shortwave radio transmitter, the one reserved for close-quarters tactical communication. He keyed the mic, breaking strict radio silence. "U-413, this is IWO Metz. U-998. His voice was high, fanatical. "We are with you. We hunt tonight. Our duty is to the Führer. We attack. Death to the English. Heil Hitler. Richter stared, frozen in disbelief. It was an act of open insubordination, a catastrophic breach. Metz had not just broken radio silence. He had used the Führer's name, confirming their presence and their ideological fervor to any Allied listening station within 1,000 miles. He grabbed the mic from Metz's hand, but the damage was done. The transmission was out. "You fool," Richter whispered, his voice shaking with a cold rage he had not felt in years. "You absolute arrogant fool." "I did my duty, Herr Kallion," Metz sneered, his eyes bright. "The kind you seem to have forgotten." "You have just killed us," Richter said. He stared at U-413, which was already turning, signaling its approval of the message. The irreversible turning point. They were no longer two boats assessing a bad situation. They were two boats committed by one zealot's fanaticism to a suicidal charge. They were shackled to a fool, and the entire North Atlantic knew they were coming. Richter turned away from Metz. He could not strike him. Not here. Not yet. "Alarm!" he roared, his voice bleak. "Dive! Dive! We go deep. We try to undo the damage you have done." As the klaxon wailed and the boat began its plunge, Richter knew it was useless. They were no longer just hunted. They had announced their own execution. Dusk bled across the surface, turning the churning water from gray to a deep, bruised purple. They ran at periscope depth, the U-998 rising and falling in the heavy swell. The air in the control room was electric, a toxic mix of CO2, anticipation, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. "Hydrophones are full, Herr Kalin." The operator's voice was tight, his hands clamped over his ears. "So many, dozens of propellers, heavy screws, fast screws, bearing 015. They are coming." "Periscope up." Richter grasped the handles. The rubber was cold and worn smooth. He rose with the column, pressing his eye to the optic. The sea was dark, but the horizon was not. It was an armada, a moving city of shadows. Against the fading light he could count 20, 30 freighters, Liberty ships, tankers, plowing eastward, and surrounding them, the wolves, not theirs, the Allies. He saw the sharp silhouettes of at least 3 destroyers and 2 smaller, faster corvettes. A dedicated hunter-killer group, exactly as he had feared. "Convoy sighted," he said, his voice a low monotone that betrayed nothing. "HX-310, moving fast." He heard Metz behind him, breathing too quickly. "Beautiful," Metz whispered. "A target-rich environment. We attack from the front, Herr Kalin, inside the screen." "They have us outnumbered 5-2, Richter said, his eye still pressed to the glass. "Their escorts are not screening. They are hunting." "Where is Bremer?" Metz demanded. "Where is U-413? "There." Richter's shoulders tensed. "Starboard flank. The fool. He's on the surface." He swung the scope. Far to the right, barely visible, was the low profile of U-413, running hard on its diesels, throwing up a white wake as it tried to position for a shot. It was suicidal. They would see that wake on their radar like a painted line. "He's charging in," Richter said, a cold sickness in his gut. "He's going to—" He didn't need to finish. The night erupted. A star shell burst high above the convoy, illuminating the sea in a harsh, magnesium-white glare. It caught U-413 perfectly, a black cigar caught in a spotlight. "He is seen," the radio operator yelled, though it was obvious. Almost instantly, a ripple of flashes came from the lead destroyer. Not its main guns. Something else. Thump, 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 thump. A series of small, dull reports. "What is that?" Metz said, moving for the other periscope. Richter knew. He had read the reports from survivors. "Hedgehog," he breathed. The name was almost comical. The weapon was not. He watched, horrified, as a pattern of small mortars arched through the air. They flew ahead of the destroyer, landing in the water all around the diving U-413. There was no countdown, no waiting for hydrostatic pressure. The world vanished in a flash of white, seen even through the periscope. It was not a single boom. It was a series of sharp, simultaneous cracks, a catastrophic, instantaneous violence. When Richter's vision cleared, the patch of water where U-413 had been was gone, replaced by a column of fire, water, and oil. The boat had been vaporized, broken in half, killed on contact. "My God," Wegener, the engineer, whispered from the ladder. "One less," Metz said, his voice shaking, but not with fear, with rage. "He died a hero. He died a fool," Richter snapped, "and he just told them exactly where we are." As if summoned by his words, a sound pierced the hull. Ping! The sharp metallic query of active ASDIC. It wasn't searching, it was locked on. Ping! Louder, closer. The lead destroyer, having dispatched Brame, was turning. Its bow was swinging directly toward their position. "He has us, Herr Callan," the hydrophone operator screamed, tearing the headphones off. "He is coming! Fast screws! Bearing 010-009. This was it. The moment of decision. The orders from OKM were clear. Angriff bis zum letzten. Attack until the last. Fight. Die. Metz was vibrating, his hand on the torpedo firing panel. "Ready tubes 1 and 2. We will take him with us." Richter looked at Metz's ecstatic, mad face. He looked at the 17-year-old radio operator, who was openly weeping, praying. He saw the flash of U-413, the pointless, stupid, wasteful death. He would not. "Alarm!" Richter roared, his voice the thunder of command. "Crash dive! Take her down! All ahead flank! Rig for silent running!" Metz froze. "What? Herr Callan? No, we fight. It is our duty. We must. I am the captain, Leutnant." Richter's voice cracked like a whip in the confined space. "And my duty is to this crew. Dive!" He shoved Metz away from the panel and hit the klaxon himself. The awooga blared, a sound of panic and escape. Ping! The destroyer was almost on top of them. "Flood all! Vents open! Take us to 200 meters! Now!" The U-998 pitched forward, a sickening, lurching drop into the abyss. Richter gripped the rail, his knuckles bone-white. He had done it. He had made the choice. He had officially disobeyed a direct order to engage. He had abandoned the attack. He had chosen his men over the mission. He looked at Metz. The IWO's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are a coward," Metz whispered, just as the first depth charge timer clicked in the water above them. Richter ignored him, his eyes fixed on the depth gauge, his entire being focused on the groaning hull. The hunt had begun. The U-998 was a falling stone. The depth gauge needle swept past 120 meters, 130, 140. The klaxon was silent now, its echo replaced by the high-pitched skreel of the hull plating. It was the sound of 1,000 tons of steel protesting the crushing, inhuman weight of the Atlantic. "Level her! Level her at 150! Richter's voice was a low command, almost swallowed by the groan of the boat. "Planes are slow, Herr Callan." Wegener, the chief engineer, yelled back, his hands white on the control wheels. "She's heavy! Something is—" Ping! The sound was no longer distant. It was inside the hull, a physical blow to the eardrums. The destroyer was directly overhead. "Silent running!" Richter ordered. "All stop!" The whine of the electric motors died, and the silence that descended was absolute. It was the silence of the abyss, terrifying and total. Every man froze. A cough, a dropped tool, a shuffle of feet. Any sound would be a death sentence, a beacon for the Aztec operator above. Richter held his breath. He could hear the thump-thump-thump of the destroyer's propellers passing over them, a fast, churning, predatory sound, and then click. A small metallic sound, clearly audible through the hull. Click, 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 click. The hydrostatic fuses. The depth charges were in the water. They were falling. Richter grabbed the rail. There was nothing to do, no maneuver, no fight. There was only the waiting. The boat was a steel coffin, and the nails were being hammered. He watched the crew. The 17-year-old radio operator had his eyes squeezed shut, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Wegener was staring at the pressure gauge, his face a mask of grim calculation. Metz was rigid, his fanaticism gone, replaced by a pale, shocked stillness. The ideological rants were useless here. Physics was in command. The charges fell past them. The first explosion was not a boom. It was a lift, a colossal upward fist that punched the U-boat from beneath. The 1,000-ton boat was thrown skyward several meters, a toy in a bathtub. Men were slammed against the ceiling. Tools rained down from their racks. "Gott in Himmel!" someone screamed. The boat shuddered, groaned, and settled. "They have our depth!" Richter roared, tasting blood from where he'd bitten his lip. "They bracketed us! The next run!" He didn't need to finish. The destroyer was already turning. The thump, thump, thump of its screws returned, faster this time. Ping! Right on top of them, click, 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 click. A full pattern. This time, Richter knew they would not be lucky. He braced, his body locked against the bulkhead. The world ended. It was not a sound, it was a tangible, violent compression. The hull screamed. The air in the control room ignited with a flash of blue ozone from the shorted electrical panels. The main lights exploded, showering the room in darkness and hot glass. A second charge went off. Closer. Whump! Richter was thrown to the deck. The steel plate beneath him buckled as if hit by a giant's hammer. A new sound joined the chaos, the high-pressure hiss of spraying water. "Lights! Emergency lights!" Richter yelled from the floor, his ears ringing. The dim red battle lanterns flickered on, casting the control room in a hellish glow. It was a nightmare. Water was jetting from a ruptured pipe near the diving controls. Men were shouting, choking. The boat was tilting, nose down. "Damage report!" Richter hauled himself up, his side aching. "Control room! Pipe ruptured!" Wegener was already wrestling with the valve, scalding water spraying his face. "Main hydrophones. Dead, Herr Kallion. The panel is black. Completely." Richter's blood went cold. Worse than the water, worse than the lights. Hydrophones dead. They were blind. They were deaf. "Chief, the hull." Wegener finally cranked the valve shut. The hissing subsided, replaced by the sound of men sobbing in the dark. She's holding," Wegener panted, wiping his face. "But, Jürgen, she's heavy. We're taking water somewhere aft, and listen." Richter listened. The skreel of the hull had changed. It was a lower, more constant groan, the sound of steel being stressed past its limits, the irreversible turning point. They had survived, but they were no longer a warship. They were a crippled, blind, and sinking wreck. The hunter-killer group, above them, knew it. The game was over. The slow death had begun. 160 meters! The report from the depth gauge operator was a strained shriek. The boat was still falling faster now. The damage aft was acting like an anchor, dragging them stern first into the black. The red emergency lights cast everything in the color of blood. "Chief, full rise on the dive planes!" Richter roared, his voice hoarse. "Electric motors, half ahead. She's not responding, Jürgen." Wegener wrestled with his wheel, his muscles bunched in the dim light. "The planes! They feel sluggish. The hydraulics must be damaged. Blow negative ballast." Blowing. The hiss of compressed air was a brief, desperate sound, but the angle of the deck barely changed. 170 meters! The hull was a symphony of agony. It was no longer a single, high-pitched squeal. It was a chorus of pops, groans, and metallic shrieks, like the joints of a giant beast being torn apart. A rivet head across the compartment shot loose, ricocheting off the bulkhead with the sound of a pistol shot. "We are rats," a voice whispered in the dark. "He's turned us into rats in a trap." It was Metz. He had pulled himself up. His face, in the red light, was a grotesque mask of fury and terror. "This is your command, Herr Kaleun," Metz spat, his voice trembling. "Your tactic. You ran, and now we die. We die a coward's death at the bottom of the sea because you would not fight." "Leutnant, secure yourself," Richter commanded, his eyes fixed on the depth gauge. The needle was sweeping past 175. Crush depth was rumored to be 200. Rumored. No one who tested it had returned. "If we had fought," Metz raved, his voice rising to a near scream, "we would have died as heroes. We would have taken one of them with us. But you, with your old-world weakness, you have doomed us. You have failed the Führer. You have failed the Reich." He was losing control, his panic manifesting as ideological rage. His terror was becoming infectious. The young radio operator was hyperventilating, his gasps audible. 180 meters! They were out of time. The boat shuddered violently. Richter knew he had seconds. He had to stop the panic, and he had to stop the descent. He turned from the gauge. He took 2 steps. He struck Metz. It was not a brawl. It was a single, precise, open-handed blow. The sound of the slap was shockingly loud in the pressurized cabin, a wet crack that cut through the hull's groaning. Metz stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock, his rant cut off mid-syllable. A red handprint bloomed instantly on his pale cheek. "Silence," Richter commanded. The word was not a shout. It was a low, guttural order that carried the absolute, undivided weight of his command. "You will be silent. You will man your station, or I will have you shot." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, shoving Wegener aside. "I have it!" Richter gripped the dive plane controls himself. He felt the sluggishness, the dead weight of the damaged boat. He was fighting the ocean itself. "All motors! Stop!" he ordered. The hum died. The boat was falling in silence. "Wegener, divert all remaining compressed air to the main ballast tanks. All of them. Blow everything, now! Jürgen, the pressure, now!" Wegener grabbed the levers. A deafening, world-ending roar filled the boat as the last of their precious compressed air screamed into the ruptured tanks. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble. If the tanks were too badly damaged, the air would just vent into the sea. If they held... The U-998 shuddered so violently, Richter thought it was tearing itself apart. The angle of the deck eased. The needle on the depth gauge, which had been racing past 185, slowed. 187, the operator read, his voice a whisper. 188. The boat hung suspended, a broken thing, groaning in the dark. 188. The needle stopped, and then, with a final jarring thud that threw every man to the deck, the U-998 slammed into the seabed. The impact was bone-jarring. A cascade of sparks erupted from the main electrical panel. Dust, cork insulation, and flakes of paint rained down. Then silence. A thick, pressurized, tomb-like silence. The groaning of the hull subsided, replaced by the quiet drip, drip, drip of a dozen new leaks. Richter pulled himself up. He tasted coppery fear in his mouth. He looked at the depth gauge. 188 meters. They were alive. They were trapped on the bottom of the Atlantic. The silence was worse than the explosions. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed in from all sides, heavier than the 188 meters of water above them. The only sounds in the red-lit control room were the drip, drip, drip of seawater from a dozen weeping seals and the harsh, shallow breathing of 44 men. They were a tomb, a steel sarcophagus resting on the cold, indifferent sand of the Atlantic floor. Richter pushed himself off the deck. His ribs ached. Every part of him ached. He ignored it. Damage? His voice was a raw croak. Report! Wegener, the chief engineer, was already moving, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He shone it on the main junction box, a black, smoking ruin. Electric motors, gone, Jürgen. The impact. It shattered the main conduits. We have no propulsion. No propulsion. The words hung in the air, each one a nail in their coffin. The hull? She's holding, Wegener said, his voice laced with disbelief. The seams are leaking. The stern torpedo room reports flooding, but the bulkhead is holding. For now, we are stable. Stable. Trapped. The words meant the same thing. Richter looked at Metz. The IWO was leaning against the chart table, his hand pressed to the cheek Richter had struck. He said nothing. His eyes, fixed on Richter, were two burning coals of hatred in the darkness. He had been proven right. They were trapped. But he had been proven a coward in the face of the descent, and his silence was more menacing than his fanaticism. A new sound, thump, thump, thump. Distant, but growing. The destroyers. They're coming back, the young radio operator whispered, his voice trembling. His hydrophones were dead, but the sound was audible even through the hull. The hunters were returning to inspect the kill. Richter grabbed the operator by the shoulder. "Your station," he ordered, his voice low and firm. "We are deaf, but we are not dead. Listen. Use your ears. Report what you hear through the hull." The boy nodded, his terror momentarily eclipsed by the direct order. Ping! The sound was clear, casual, a bright, inquisitive hammer blow against their steel coffin. The destroyer was above them, sweeping the bottom. Ping! Closer. "He's searching the debris field," Richter whispered. "He's looking for the wreckage, for us." The crew was frozen. One man was stifling a sob. Richter knew what he had to do. The battle was over. The war of survival had begun. It would not be a war of torpedoes and guns. It would be a war of silence. "Listen to me," Richter said, his voice just loud enough to carry through the compartment. "Listen. Geräuschlos, silent running. From this moment, there is no sound. None." He moved through the compartment, his own feet preternaturally quiet on the slick deck. "All non-essential machinery. Off. Gyro. Off." "Herr Kalin," Wegener protested, "without the gyro." "We are not going anywhere, Chief. It makes a hum. Turn it off. Air scrubbers. Off. Ventilation. Off." A collective gasp. Turning off the air scrubbers and ventilation was a death sentence. It meant the CO2 would build. It meant they were starting the clock on their own suffocation. "We have air for 8, maybe 10 hours if we are lucky," Richter continued, his gaze moving from man to man, locking their eyes. "The British above us have patience, but they do not have unlimited fuel. We will be quieter than the sand we are sitting on. We will not move. We will not speak. We will not even think loudly. We will become a piece of the bottom. We will become stone. Do you understand me?" He received a series of terrified, jerky nods. "Do it, Chief." Wegener hesitated, then pulled the main levers. The last faint hum of the machinery died. The silence that descended was absolute. It was the silence of a crypt. Now, the drip, drip, drip of the leaks sounded like hammer blows. Ping, directly overhead. The destroyer was right on top of them. Richter stood motionless. He could feel the proximity of the enemy ship, a vast, living presence. He imagined the British ASDIC operator in his warm cabin, listening, his head tilted. Could he hear them? Could he hear the water dripping? Could he hear the frantic pounding of 44-4s? Hearts. Ping. Another. Richter closed his eyes. This was the ultimate test of his command. Not the charge, not the fight, the waiting, the quiet fortitude of enduring the terror of the unknown, of forcing his will upon 44 terrified men, forcing them to be silent while death itself circled just meters above their heads. He watched the second hand of his chronometer. Sweep, sweep, sweep. Each tick was an eternity. Thump, thump, thump. The propeller noise was fading. Ping, fainter, ping, more distant. He waited. 1 minute, 5, 10. The silence in the U-boat was so profound he could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. The destroyer had not dropped charges. It was leaving. It must have assumed the hedgehogs had done their work, that U-998 was just another broken wreck among the convoy's debris. He allowed himself a single, slow breath. They had survived the first test. He looked at the air quality gauge. The needle was already imperceptibly, undeniably, starting to creep toward the red. They were alive, and they were dying. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the sweep of the chronometer's second hand, illuminated by the single dim red bulb over the chart table. 1 hour, 2. The silence in the U-boat was no longer a tactic. It was a symptom of their impending death. The air was the first to betray them. It became thick, heavy, like breathing through a wet wool blanket. Every breath was a conscious effort, a shallow pant that did not satisfy the lungs. The CO2 was building, a slow, invisible poison. Richter stood motionless, his back against the bulkhead. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. It was the first sign of hypercapnia. Soon would come the dizziness, then the confusion, then the blackness. He scanned his men. They were shadows in the red gloom. A few, the veterans, sat with their heads in their hands, conserving every molecule of oxygen. The younger ones, they were struggling. The 17-year-old radio operator was coughing, a dry, hacking sound that was appallingly loud in the stillness. Each cough was a betrayal. "Water," Richter whispered, his own voice sounding strange and distant. A crewman passed a cup. The operator drank, his hands shaking. He looked at Richter, his eyes wide with a question Richter could not answer. Richter's gaze shifted to Metz. The IWO had not moved. He sat on his stool, his arms crossed, staring at Richter. The red light caught the faint, dark purple of the handprint on his cheek. His hatred was a palpable thing in the small compartment. It was no longer hot. It was cold, patient. It was the hatred of a man who felt his glorious death had been stolen, replaced by this sordid, slow, cowardly suffocation. Metz was waiting for Richter to fail, waiting for him to break. Richter turned away, back to his instruments. The depth gauge, 188 meters. The CO2 gauge, the needle was deep in the red. The chronometer, 6 hours since the last explosion. He forced himself to listen. He strained his ears, listening past the drip, drip, drip of the leaks, past the rasp of his own lungs. Nothing, no ping, no thump, thump, thump of propellers. He had been listening to the silence for so long, he had failed to notice its quality had changed. It was no longer the silence of a mouse hiding from a cat. It was the silence of emptiness. They were gone. The destroyers had left. Their fuel or their patience had run out. They had written U-998 off as scrap metal on the bottom. He had done it. He had outlasted them. A small, dangerous kernel of hope flickered in his chest. "Wegener," he whispered. The chief engineer, who had been slumped over his panel, stirred. His face was slick with sweat. "Turn on the scrubbers," Richter ordered. "Just the scrubbers, and the ventilation. Low." The click of the switch was a gunshot. A low electric hum followed, the most beautiful sound Richter had ever heard. The fans began to turn, stirring the toxic, humid air. Men gasped, coughing, as the marginally cleaner air began to circulate. It was still foul, still reeked of oil and unwashed bodies, but the edge was taken off. We're alive, Herr Kaleon?" the radio operator asked, his voice cracking. "We are alive," Richter said. He motioned to Wegener. "Chief, to the engine room. I want a full damage report, the real one. What did the impact do? Can we repair the motors? Can we surface?" Wegener nodded, his face grim. He picked up a flashlight and a wrench and disappeared through the bulkhead, sealing the hatch behind him. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Richter's life. The crew was stirring, a low murmur of hope passing through the boat. They were looking at him as a savior, the man who had faced down the destroyers with silence, the man who would get them out. Richter just stared at the sealed hatch. It opened. Wegener emerged, his face black with grease. He didn't look at the crew. He looked only at Richter. He sealed the hatch. "My office," Richter said, pointing to the tiny, curtained-off navigation area. They ducked inside. Richter pulled the curtain. "Speak," Richter said. "The motors—" Wegener began, his voice flat, dead, shattered. "The casings are cracked. The electrical conduits are a fused mess. They are gone, Jürgen. We have no propulsion. Ever." Richter absorbed the blow. "The ballast tanks." Wegener closed his eyes. He didn't need the flashlight to see the damage. He had felt it with his hands, in the dark, flooded compartments. It's not good. The explosions, the hedgehogs, and the impact. They didn't just rupture the external tanks. The shrapnel. It's punched through the pressure hull itself into the tanks. They're sieves. "Can we blow them?" Richter's voice was a whisper. "Use the last of the compressed air?" "No." Wegener shook his head. "Jürgen, don't you understand? There's nothing to blow. The tanks are open to the sea. We try to pump air. It will just vent. It will bubble to the surface, and we will stay right here. There is no force. There is no buoyancy. We cannot surface." The flicker of hope in Richter's chest didn't just die. It was extinguished, plunging him into a cold darkness deeper than the 188 meters of water above. It was a false dawn. They hadn't been saved. They had been left to die, a slower death. He pulled back the curtain. The entire control room crew was watching him, their faces pale, etched with a desperate, terrible hope. Richter said nothing. He didn't have to. The truth was on his face. The hope in their eyes died, one by one. He looked over at Metz. The IWO was watching him, and for the first time in days, he smiled. It was a ghastly, triumphant sneer. Richter had saved them from the enemy only to deliver them to the abyss. The silence that followed Wegener's verdict was a living thing. It was the sound of 44 men staring into their own mass grave. The fragile hope that had sustained them for the past hour shattered, and the thick, toxic air of the control room filled with a despair as tangible as the rising CO2. A man in the corner began to weep. It was not a loud, dramatic sound, but a quiet, rhythmic, hopeless sobbing that was infinitely more terrible. The 17-year-old radio operator had his head between his knees, his body trembling, trying to control the cough that now racked his burning lungs. Richter watched them. He was a captain of a ship that was no longer a ship. He was the warden of a tomb. "So this is your survival, Herr Kaleun?" Metz's voice was soft, laced with a venomous, triumphant poison. "This is the victory you chose for us, to die of our own bad air, to suffocate like vermin. My way was quick, it was clean, it was German." Richter ignored him. His focus was on the air quality gauge. The needle was climbing. The scrubbers, running on the last dregs of the failing battery, were losing the fight. Another 2 hours, maybe 3. Then the coughing would stop, replaced by the lethargy, the confusion, and the final dark sleep. He was staring at the gauge when Wegener touched his arm. The chief engineer's face was a mask of grease, sweat, and a desperate burning intensity. He jerked his head toward the navigation curtain. Richter followed. "There is no hope, Jürgen," Richter said, his voice flat, exhausted. "You said it yourself." "I said the tanks were sieves," Wegener whispered, his voice rough. He was vibrating, his mind working with the feverish energy of a man who refuses to die. "I said we cannot blow them. I did not say there was nothing to blow." "What are you talking about?" "The compressors. We still have maybe 1/10 of our high-pressure air. The last reserve. We were saving it for, I don't know, for this." "It's not enough to lift us, Chief. You said it would just vent." "It will, if we try to fill the ballast tanks." Wegener gripped Richter's arm, his dirty fingernails digging in. "But the hull itself, it's breached aft. That's where the water is. But forward it is only weeping. The bulkheads, they are still holding. Just." Richter stared, not understanding. "Get to the point, Wegener. We don't try to lift the boat with the tanks. We try to lift the boat with the boat. We seal the forward compartments, engine, control, torpedo. We make them as airtight as we can. Then we reroute the main compressors. We open the valves, all of them. We pump every last atmosphere of compressed air directly into the boat itself." Richter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Atlantic. "You mean pressurize the inside of the hull?" "Yes," Wegener hissed. "It's madness. It's a 1 in 100 chance. But if the bulkheads hold, the internal pressure will become immense. It will equalize with the sea pressure. It will stop the leaks. And then it will push the water out of the aft breaches. It will turn the entire U-boat into one giant, leaking, unstable balloon. And the crew? Our ears will burst. We will bleed. It might kill us from the pressure alone. More likely, the sudden change will cause the hull to implode, a catastrophic failure." "A quick death," Richter said, his mind racing. "A quick death," Wegener agreed. Or the sudden, violent expulsion of water will create just enough positive buoyancy, just enough to pop us, to break us free from the mud and send us to the surface. It's a mechanic's gambit, Jürgen, a straw. But it is something." Richter was silent for a full minute. He looked through the curtain at Metz, who was now cleaning his Walter, a look of grim, almost peaceful acceptance on his face. The fanatic, content with his coming death. He looked back at Wegener. The pragmatist, the engineer, covered in grease, offering an insane, impossible chance at life built on physics and desperation. It was no choice at all. It was the only choice, competence over dogma. "Do it," Richter said. He stepped out from behind the curtain. His voice was no longer the whisper of a condemned man. It was the command of a captain. "All hands, listen, we have one chance." He explained the plan. He did not lie. He did not soften it. He told them it would be agony. He told them it would almost certainly kill them. He gave them the 1 in 100 odds. And he saw it. The thing he had thought was dead. Hope. A terrible, sharp, painful hope returned to their eyes. They preferred the violent, uncertain death to the slow, certain one. "Fools!" Metz shouted, standing up, the Walther in his hand. "Tinkering! You play with valves like children. If we are to die, we die." "We die trying, Leutnant," Richter cut him off. He walked directly toward the Idwowo, his gaze locked on the pistol. "We die trying. That is the only order that matters now. Put the weapon down and help the chief, or I will relieve you of your duty and your life." Metz stared, his ideological certainty warring with the absolute cold authority in Richter's eyes. Slowly, with a look of utter disgust, Metz lowered the pistol. "Chief," Richter said, turning his back on Metz, "your boat." Wegener nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Seal the bulkheads, aft engine room, aft torpedo room. Seal them now. Move!" The crew, galvanized by a final, desperate purpose, scrambled to their tasks. They turned the heavy steel wheels, sealing the aft compartments, condemning them to the sea. They were turning their own boat into a pressure vessel, into a bomb. In 5 minutes, it was done. The crew was crammed into the forward half of the U-boat. "All sealed, Chief." Wegener was at the compressor manifold, his hand on the main valve. He looked at Richter. Richter nodded. "Blow us to heaven, Chief." Wegener gripped the red wheel with both hands and, with a desperate grunt, spun it open. The sound was not a hiss. It was a roar. A deafening, screaming hurricane of air released from 300 atmospheres, exploding into the compartment. The pressure was a physical blow, a giant's hand clapping over their ears. Richter felt a sharp, agonizing pop deep inside his skull. His nose began to bleed instantly, warm liquid running over his lips. The boat shrieked. The roar of the compressed air was a physical assault. Richter felt the pressure not just in his ears, but in his sinuses, his teeth, his very bones. Blood streamed from his nose, hot and metallic. Beside him, the young radio operator screamed, a thin, silent shriek as he clawed at his bleeding ears. The U-boat screamed. The hull was a living thing, protesting the insane, equalizing pressure. Water, which had been seeping from a dozen cracks, stopped. Wegener's physics were correct. Then the boat lurched. It was a violent upward shove. A grinding, tearing sound came from the stern as the boat broke free from the seabed's mud. They were rising. A collective, unspoken cry of hope. The boat lifted, perhaps 5 meters. It tilted agonizingly to port. It hung suspended for a single terrible second, and then, with a final defeated groan, it settled. It did not fall back into its old position. It slid, dragged by the flooded stern, and slammed back onto the sand with a dull, muddy thud. The gambit had failed. Wegener, his face a mask of blood and oil, looked at the depth gauge. 188 meters. It hadn't changed. He looked at Richter and slowly, defeatedly, shook his head. The roar of the air stopped. The compressors were empty, and the silence that returned was the silence of the grave. They had used everything. Their last torpedo, their last maneuver, their last breath of compressed air. And they were still here. But the air was different. The massive injection of pressure had bought them a few more minutes of consciousness, but it had also used the last of their reserves. The air quality gauge was now useless. The air was poison. A man slumped to the deck, not with a crash, but a soft, boneless collapse. No one moved to help him. They hadn't the strength. "So," Metz whispered. His voice was thick, his own breathing ragged. He had a trickle of blood from one ear. "That was your mechanics miracle. A fine performance." He leaned back, his eyes hazy, almost drunk from the CO2. "Now, we wait." Richter looked at the 17-year-old radio operator. The boy was crying, rocking back and forth, holding his ruined ears. "Funker," Richter said, his own voice sounding distant, his tongue thick. "The radio." The boy looked up, uncomprehending. "The radio," Richter repeated, forcing the words. "The emergency transmitter. Gisela, you can send a message to your family. One last message." It was a breach of every protocol, a final, useless, sentimental act. Metz laughed, a dry, coughing sound. "Sentiment? How pathetic." Richter ignored him. He crawled the 2 meters to the radio station, his limbs impossibly heavy. He pulled the boy to the seat. "Send," he gasped. "Try." The boy, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the key, nodded. It was a final, tangible task, a last piece of dignity. He switched the small, battery-powered emergency set on. A weak hum. He put the headphones over his bleeding ears, wincing, and began to tap the Morse key. Dit-dit-dit, dat-dat-dat, dit-dit-dit, SOS. Then he began to tap out his mother's address in Kiel. Richter slumped against the bulkhead, watching him. This was the end. Not a glorious battle, but a slow, quiet fade out in the dark, listening to a child's last words. He felt a strange, cold peace. He had failed his country. He had failed his command. But he had not. He had not been Metz. The boy stopped tapping. His body went rigid. His eyes, visible in the dim red light, went wide with a fresh, raw terror that cut through the CO2-induced haze. He was listening. "Funker? What is it?" Richter's mind was slow. The boy tore the headphones off, his face a mask of disbelief. "Herr Kaleun," he gasped, his voice a terrified squeak. "A transmission, surface, clear." "What? An Allied signal?" "No, not a signal. Propellers, screw noises, right. Richter didn't need to hear the rest. Ping. The sound was not a memory. It was real. It was a bright, loud, casual hammer blow directly on top of their hull. They hadn't left. The destroyers hadn't left. The sonar pings faded because the ship had stopped, cutting its engines, listening, floating, waiting, a cat-and-mouse game. They had been up there, in the dark, for hours, waiting for the dying submarine to make one last desperate sound, the roar of their compressors, the lurch of the hull. It must have been a thunderclap to the British hydrophones. Richter stared at the weeping bulkhead. The enemy captain. He was patient. He was a professional. He wasn't a fanatic. He was just good. Ping, louder, closer. It was no longer searching. It was locking. Richter looked at the collapsing crew, at the useless radio, at the rising water. The air was gone. The CO2 was critical, and the hunter had returned to finish the job. The bulkhead wept, each drip a tiny hammer in the pressurized silence. Ping, the destroyer's sonar, right above them, no longer searching. It was a casual, confident hunting sound, a sound of execution. Korvettenkapitän Jürgen Richter held the steel rail, his knuckles white against the gray, sweating metal. The red emergency light was failing, flickering, casting the control room in a pulsing, hellish twilight. The air was unbreathable. It was a thick, hot soup of CO2, battery acid, and the stench of human fear. Men were collapsing, slumping to the deck, their lungs burning, too weak to even cough. "She's venting, Herr Kaleon," the chief engineer, Wegener, whispered. His voice was a raw crackle over the hum of the dying gyro, which Richter had ordered back on in a final, useless gesture. "The main seal? It's giving way." Richter nodded, his gaze fixed on the depth gauge. 188 meters. It felt like a gravestone epitaph. Ping. "He's toying with us," Leutnant Metz grated. Richter turned. The IWO was on his feet. The CO2 haze that fogged Richter's mind, that was sending the rest of the crew into a final lethargic sleep, seemed to have energized Metz. His eyes were unnaturally bright, his face pale and slick. He was fueled by a pure, fanatical clarity. "He waits," Metz continued, his voice resonating with a new, terrible authority. "He waits for us to die of our own poison. A dishonorable end. I will not allow it." "There is nothing to allow, Lieutenant," Richter gasped. His own limbs felt like lead. It was so hard to think. "It is over." "It is over when we say it is over," Metz declared. "We surface. We fight. One torpedo. We still have one in the forward tube. We will fire it at the surface. For the Führer. For our honor." "The hydrophones are shattered, Metz." Richter's words were slurred. "The motors are gone. The hull is compromised. We do not surface. Cowardice." The word was sharp, a slap that momentarily cleared Richter's head. Metz's hand moved, not toward the controls, toward the Walter holstered on his belt. "I will not die like this," Metz said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "I will not let this crew die because of your failure, your weakness." He drew the pistol. The click of the safety being disengaged echoed, appallingly loud, louder than the sonar, louder than the drip of the failing bulkhead. Richter looked at the IWO. He looked at the slumped, near-comatose form of the 17-year-old radio operator. He saw only dead boys. "You will stand down, Lieutenant," Richter ordered, but the words had no force. They were just air. "I will not." Metz raised the Walter. "I am relieving you of command, Herr Kaleon, on the authority of the Reich." He gestured with the pistol to two other crewmen, younger men, who still had the faint spark of Metz's fanaticism in their oxygen-starved eyes. "Sailors, arrest this man. He is a traitor. He has refused his duty." The two crewmen looked at Metz, at the gun, then at Richter. They struggled, wavering, to their feet. They began to move, shuffling, toward their captain. This was the final, irreversible moment. The all is lost. Richter was facing a mutiny 188 meters down, with an enemy ship waiting above and an inescapable death filling the air he breathed. He had no crew, he had no ship, he had no options. Metz turned from him, the gun still, held ready and moved toward the ballast controls. "If you will not give the order," Metz said, his hand reaching for the emergency blow levers, "I will." Metz's hand, white-knuckled, grasped the red lever for the emergency ballast blow. The pistol in his other hand was rock-steady, aimed not at Richter, but at the compartment at large. A general threat. The two young sailors, loyal to his fanaticism, shuffled closer to Richter. Their movements were slow, drunken, their bodies rebelling against the poisoned air. Richter did not move. He was too tired to be afraid. The CO2 was a heavy shroud, slowing his thoughts, his reactions. But through the fog, one cold, clear thought remained. A single immutable fact that Metz, in his ideological fervor, had forgotten. Physics. Richter did not raise his hands. He did not plead. He simply spoke. His voice was a thick, slurred rasp, but it cut through the hypoxic haze. "Leutnant." Metz ignored him, his eyes fixed on the lever, his lips moving in a silent prayer to his Führer. He was preparing for his final glorious act. "Metz," Richter said again, louder. "Look, at the gauge." "Our fate is not in gauges," Metz spat. "It is in our will." "The air," Richter forced the words. "Look at the air quality gauge, Leutnant." He was not appealing to Metz's humanity. He was appealing to his training as a U-boat officer. Metz was many things: a fanatic, a zealot, a fool, but he was also a technician. He had passed his exams. He knew what the instruments meant. Metz's gaze flickered against his will to the CO2 dial. The needle was not in the red. It was past the red, buried against the final pin. A physical impossibility. "It is irrelevant," Metz said, but a micron of doubt had entered his voice. "You surface now," Richter continued, pushing the words out, each one an agony. "You blow everything. We rise. How long? To the surface? From this depth?" Metz's eyes glazed, the calculation automatic. Three minutes, maybe 4, with the damage." 3 minutes, Richter repeated. He slowly, deliberately, pointed. Not at Metz, not at the gun. He pointed at the 17-year-old radio operator who was slumped over his dead equipment. "Look at him," Richter commanded, his voice a low growl. Metz looked. The boy was not just pale, he was blue, a waxy gray-blue color that Richter had seen before on drowned men. His lips were the color of dark plums. His chest was still. "He is not breathing, Leutnant," Richter whispered. The 2 sailors who had been shuffling toward Richter stopped. They, too, looked at the boy. He is weak," Metz stammered, his fanaticism fighting the evidence. "He is dead," Richter said, the words a cold, flat stone in the poisonous air. "Or he will be in 30 seconds. The air in this boat is finished. It is not low. It is toxic. It is unlivable." He saw the flicker, the terrible, undeniable logic dawning in Metz's oxygen-starved brain. "You surface now, Leutnant," Richter pressed, his voice a rasp. "You are a ghost ship before you break the waves. You will open the hatch to a boat full of corpses. Your glorious torpedo will sit in its tube. Your heroes will be blue, like him." He paused, taking a ragged, burning breath. "Is that your glorious death, Leutnant? To die of physics while trying to make a speech? You are too late." The gun wavered. Metz stared at the radio operator. He stared at the air gauge. He looked at his own hand on the ballast lever. He was a fanatic, but he was not stupid. He knew chemistry, he knew biology. He knew with a sudden, soul-crushing certainty that Richter was right. His plan was not a glorious last stand. It was a pointless, posthumous spasm. The pistol, held high with such ideological certainty, lowered an inch, then 2. The 2 young sailors looked from Metz to Richter, their faces slack with confusion. The mutiny, built on a foundation of pure, burning will, had just collapsed against the cold, unfeeling wall of reality. Metz's hand, slowly, agonizingly, uncurled from the red lever. His face, in the flickering red light, was no longer a mask of fervor. It was a mask of despair. Richter had not just taken his life. He had taken his death. The Walter hung heavy in Metz's hand, its muzzle pointing at the slick steel deck. The fanatical light had drained from his eyes, leaving a hollow, hypoxic haze. He had seen the cold, unassailable truth. His glorious death was a chemical impossibility. His will, forged in the fires of ideology, had just been extinguished by a lack of oxygen. Richter watched him, his own body screaming, his vision tunneling. He had won the argument, but the victory was as useless as the dead air they were breathing. Ping. The destroyer was still there, patient, waiting for the tomb to fall silent. The moment stretched, suspended in the poisonous red-lit gloom. Metz's defeat, Richter's exhaustion, the crew's slow, soft slide into unconsciousness. It was Wegener who broke the spell. The chief engineer had been slumped against the bulkhead, a dark, greasy shadow who had watched the entire confrontation with the cold, pragmatic eyes of a man who deals only in broken machinery. He saw a broken part. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Wegener lunged. He was not a fighter, he was a mechanic. He moved with a brutal, economic purpose, bringing the heavy, long-handled steel wrench from his belt in a short, efficient arc. It struck the back of Metz's skull. The sound was not a crack. It was a dull, wet, obscene thud. Metz's eyes rolled up, white in the red light. He made no sound. He simply collapsed, a puppet with its strings cut, his body hitting the deck with a heavy, final sound. The Walther skidded from his grip, clattering across the compartment and coming to rest against the radio operator's still boot. No one spoke. The two young sailors who had supported Metz stared, their mouths open, too oxygen-starved to process the sudden, brutish violence. Wegener stood over the IWO's body, swaying, the wrench in his hand. He looked at Richter, his face a mask of grease. He was a problem, the chief gasped, his lungs burning. And then, his last burst of energy spent, he, too, slid down the bulkhead, the wrench thudding to the deck. Richter stared at Metz's unmoving form. An execution, an act of brutal necessity. And Richter felt nothing, not shock, not gratitude, just a vast, cold emptiness. The mutiny was over, the ideological war was over. He was in sole command of a dying boat. Ping, the destroyer, still waiting. Richter knew, with a sudden, final clarity, what was left to do. It was no longer a choice. It was the only line of code left to run. He shuffled, his legs dragging, his boots heavy as lead, to the emergency locker above the chart table. His movements were a slow-motion parody, each one a monumental effort of will. He fumbled with the latch. It opened. He pulled out the signal pistole, the flare pistol, and beside it a small, watertight, buoyant canister, the Rettungsboje, the marker buoy. He turned, the pistol heavy in his hand. The few remaining conscious men watched him, their eyes dull. They thought perhaps he was going to shoot himself. End the suffering. Richter stumbled over to Wegener. He kicked the chief's boot hard. "Chief, Wegener. One last job." Wegener's eyes fluttered open, hazy, unfocused. Richter pushed the marker buoy into the engineer's hands. "The tube," he gasped, pointing to the small, 1-meter-long launch tube used for expelling signals. "Release it." Wegener's eyes widened, a flicker of pained understanding. This was not a weapon. This was not a miracle. This was surrender. "All remaining compressed air," Richter panted, his lungs on fire, each word a spike. "The last reserve, not to the tanks, to this tube, just this." Wegener nodded, a slow, grim acceptance. He crawled, dragging himself like a wounded animal to the manifold. He coupled the small auxiliary hose to the buoy's launch tube. Richter turned to the flare pistol. He broke it open. He took a single red flare and then put it back, his fingers clumsy. He fumbled, grabbing the white one. The flare of parley. The flare of defeat. He loaded the pistol with a heavy click. He staggered to the main hatch. He looked at Wegener. "Now, Chief," he whispered. Wegener turned a small red valve. There was a muffled pneumatic cough, followed by the whoosh of the buoy being expelled from the boat. A high-pitched squeal as the last of their air shoved it upward. It was gone. Their final message, a small, floating piece of metal, admitting failure, begging for life, rising through 188 meters of black water. Richter raised the heavy flare pistol. He pointed it at the small secondary signal port in the hull, designed for this exact unthinkable purpose. He knew the destroyer was up there. He knew they were listening. The buoy, it might be seen as a trick, a diversion. He needed one more signal, a white flag. He pulled the trigger. The whump of the flare launching inside the tiny, sealed tube was deafening, the recoil jarring his already weak body. He watched its bright, white-hot tail vanish up the pipe. He had done it. He had failed his country. He had failed his oath to the Reich. He had committed the ultimate act of treason. And as he slumped to the deck, the pistol falling from his numb fingers, he felt an immense, crushing, and utterly profound wave of relief. He had not failed his men. He had given them their 1-in-a-million chance, not to fight, not to win, but to live. He closed his eyes. The red light was fading. The darkness was warm. He was so tired. The pinging, it had stopped. The blackness was warm. It was a heavy, comfortable blanket, and Richter was sinking into it. The pain in his lungs had faded. The throbbing in his head was a distant drum. There was no sound, no ping, no drip. The silence was complete. It was peaceful. A new sound, a loud rhythmic clang. Richter's consciousness resisted. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the quiet dark. Clang, clang, clang. It was metal, heavy metal, on their hull. Not a weapon, a tool. It was coming from above, from the conning tower. A high-pitched, abrasive screech, the sound of a steel wheel being forced against immense pressure. They were opening the hatch from the outside. His eyes, which he thought were closed, flickered. The red light was gone, replaced by an absolute impenetrable black. The batteries were finally dead. Then a hiss. It was not the hiss of their own compressed air. It was a new sound, the sound of a seal breaking, a rush of air. It was not a gentle draft. It was a cold, violent waterfall. It slammed into Richter's face and it burned. It was an agonizing, icy fire that plunged into his ruined CO2-saturated lungs. He convulsed. A deep, racking cough tore through his body, a spasm so violent it felt like his ribs were breaking. He was no longer dying. He was being resurrected, and it was agony. He heard other coughs around him, groans, the sounds of men being dragged back from the edge of suffocation. The air tasted of salt and diesel smoke and life, a light. It was not a dim red bulb. It was a focused, impossibly bright white beam. It cut through the darkness, illuminating the compartment in a stark, terrifying glare. It was a flashlight, an alien eye. The beam found Richter, pinning him against the bulkhead. He threw a hand up, his arm feeling like it weighed 1,000 kilos. A shape filled the open hatch above. It was a man, but bulky, inhuman, silhouetted against a gray, swirling sky. The figure wore a gas mask, its round, goggled eyes making it look like an insect. "Right!" a voice shouted, muffled by the mask, echoing in the steel tube. It was English. "Got 'em! Air's foul, but it's not gas. Get the ladder. Let's have you." Another figure appeared. They dropped a rope ladder. It hit the deck with a wet thud. "Come on!" the voice yelled, impatient. "Out! Raus! Hände hoch! On the deck now! You! Move!" The beam of light found Wegener. The chief engineer was stirring, his face a mask of black grease and dried blood, his eyes squinting against the light. "Go!" Richter rasped. The word was a dry tear in his throat. "Wegener, go! Get the men!" He forced his own leaden limbs to move. He was the captain. He shoved Wegener toward the ladder. "Up! Move!" The British sailors were shouting. "One at a time! Hands up! We see any weapons! You're dead! Move it!" It was a slow, pathetic parody of an evacuation, a line of ghosts pulling themselves from a grave. Wegener, his body trembling, got his hands on the ladder and began the slow, agonizing climb. Another sailor, one of the two who had supported Metz, crawled, sobbing, toward it. Richter watched them go. He was the captain. He would be the last. His gaze fell on Metz. The IWO was a dark shape on the deck, unmoving. The light beam swept past him, indifferent, a piece of debris. His gaze fell on the 17-year-old radio operator, still slumped over his console, his waxy, blue-tinted skin stark in the flashlight's glare. One by one, the survivors, those who had not succumbed to the CO2, those who had not been crushed by the explosions, were pulled or pushed up the ladder. Perhaps 15, maybe 20, out of 44. "That's the last of 'em," a British voice shouted from above. "Just the one left." The beam found Richter. He was alone, standing in a tomb, surrounded by his dead. "Your turn, Kapitän," the voice said. The words spat with a mix of contempt and curiosity. "Up! Now!" Richter put his hand on the rope ladder. The fibers were rough, wet with sea spray. He put his foot on the first rung. He had no strength. His body was a dead weight. He climbed. Each rung was an eternity. His arms were water. His lungs were fire. He was pushed from below by a British sailor who had climbed down and pulled from above by two more. He breached the hatch. He fell, not onto the small, familiar deck of his U-boat, but onto a vast, vibrating steel plane, the deck of the destroyer. The wind hit him. It was not a draft. It was a physical, roaring force, full of ice and salt and the smell of the ship's smokestack. It tore the last of the CO2 from his lungs and slapped him with the cold, wet, brutal reality of the North Atlantic. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, shivering, his body convulsing. He was surrounded. Tall men in dark, dripping uniforms. They held Sten guns, their muzzles pointed at him. Their faces were hard, young, exhausted. They were the enemy. He looked up. The sky was a low, gray, turbulent ceiling. The sea was a violent, endless expanse of white-capped waves. He was a prisoner. He was a traitor. He had lost his boat. He had lost his honor. He took another breath, and the sheer, agonizing, beautiful pain of the clean, cold air filled his chest. He was alive. He was given a blanket. It was rough, wool, and smelled of diesel oil and damp, but it was dry. He stood by the destroyer's aft railing, shivering, a guard with a Sten gun standing 5 meters away, watching him with a detached, professional weariness. The rest of his men, the survivors, the 20 or so ghosts pulled from the tomb, were already huddled near a hatch, being processed by a grim-faced petty officer. Richter had been separated. The officers always were. He looked out. The gray, hostile Atlantic was the same from this deck as it had been from his own, just higher. The wind was a solid wall, tearing the smoke from the destroyer's funnel and ripping the tops off the waves. He saw her, U-9998. She was still on the surface, just barely. The British boarding party, the one that had pulled him from the hatch, had returned to the destroyer. His boat was wallowing in the swell, her deck awash, her conning tower listing heavily. She looked broken, defeated. A series of flashes came from the destroyer's deck, forward, the sharp, barking crack of the ship's smaller caliber guns. They were scuttling her, pumping shells into her hull to finish the job. Richter watched, his face impassive, as his command, his home, his prison, was executed. He watched the white plumes of water rise as the shells struck. He felt a strange, cold detachment. He felt no anger, no patriotic rage. He felt no sadness for the steel. He thought only of the bodies still inside. The young radio operator, Metz, the men who had died from the CO2 before the hatch was ever opened. He saw Metz's face in his mind, the look of profound, absolute despair when his glorious death had been stolen by physics. Metz had died for an idea. Richter had lived for the men, and the sea, in its cold indifference, had taken both. The U-998 began her final dive. The bow lifted just for a moment as the stern, heavy with its dead and its flooded compartments, plunged. She slid backward, the conning tower vanishing with a final oily surge. A patch of bubbling, churning foam marked the spot. Then, nothing. Just the gray, unforgiving sea. Richter did not realize he was shivering so violently until a new voice cut through the wind. "Nasty business." He turned. A man stood there, not in the rough gear of a sailor, but in a clean officer's uniform, a heavy bridge coat buttoned to the neck. He was older, perhaps Richter's age, with the same weary eyes. He held 2 mugs, steam rising from them. The British captain, the captain, held one out. Richter stared at the mug. His guard tensed, shifting the Sten gun, but the captain waved him down. Slowly, Richter's numb, gloved hand took it. It was hot. Tea, thick, black, impossibly sweet. He sipped. The liquid fire was an agonizing, welcome shock to his frozen system. The British captain took a long pull from his own mug, his gaze fixed on the patch of roiling water where the U-boat had been. "You were the last one out," the captain said. It was not a question. "My ASDIC operator, he said you were a patient bastard. He thought he'd lost you. Then you blew your compressors. After that, he said you were just waiting." Richter said nothing. He just gripped the hot mug. "My patrol was over. I was low on fuel. I should have been halfway to Derry by now," the captain continued, almost to himself. "But my operator, he insisted you were still there. He heard you creaking. So we waited, cut the engines, just drifted, and listened." He turned, his blue eyes locking on Richter's. There was no triumph in them, just a deep, profound, professional exhaustion. "That marker buoy, the flare, that was a first," the captain said. "My men thought it was a trick, another damned acoustic torpedo, but you were right on the bottom, no way to fire. It was not a trick." Richter finally found his voice. It was a rasp. "The air was gone." The British captain nodded, a short, sharp gesture. "We saw that. The men we pulled out, half dead. My corpsman, he doesn't know how any of you were still conscious. The boy, the one at the radio, he didn't make it." "I know," Richter whispered. The captain finished his tea. He took the empty mug from Richter's unresisting hand. He looked at the huddled, shivering group of German sailors, then back at Richter. "You lost half your crew in the attack," the captain stated, "and you lost your boat, and your war. But you did right by your men, Captain. That's more than most can say in this bloody mess." He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a word of comfort. It was just a flat, professional assessment, a statement of fact, from one captain to another. And in that moment, Richter felt the crushing weight of his failure, his treason, his disobedience, his lost honor, simply evaporate. The British captain's words were a strange, unexpected absolution. They were a validation that Metz, with his oaths and his pistol, could never have understood. He had sacrificed his honor to the Reich to preserve his humanity. And in doing so, he had found a different, quieter, and more terrible kind of honor. He was no wolf. He was just a man, a shepherd who had brought half his flock, broken but breathing, out of the abyss. "Guard!" the captain called, his voice once again the bark of command. "Take the prisoner below. Get him to the petty officer's mess. See that he's processed." The guard gestured with the Sten gun. "This way, Capitan." Richter turned his back on the empty, endless Atlantic. He turned away from the grave of U-998. He felt the cold steel of the destroyer's deck beneath his boots. He straightened his back, or as much as his shivering, exhausted body would allow. He was a prisoner. His war was over. He had survived. And, for the first time in 5 years, his conscience was clear. He followed the guard toward the hatch and the long, uncertain darkness of the life that lay ahead.